Moving to the outskirts had always been my dream, a longing for peace and a fresh start. When George suggested looking for a house away from the city noise, I agreed without hesitation. The house we found was perfect. Spacious, full of light, and with a view of the park. It was everything I had imagined for our life together. I thought this change would be an opportunity to reconnect, to recover the bond that time and routine had worn down. However, the first few days in the new house brought a strange sensation, a mix of joy and emptiness. While I spent my days organizing, George was still absorbed in his work, absent for long hours. It was a pattern that had repeated before, but this time, against the backdrop of the calm new environment, it became more evident. In that solitude, I met Mathew, our neighbor. I first saw him when I was struggling to carry some boxes. He offered to help with a kindness that initially made me uncomfortable but later appreciated. Tall, with a carefree air and a constant smile, there was something about him that drew attention. In our casual encounters, I learned he worked from home as an architect. His relaxed and attentive presence contrasted sharply with George's, who always seemed overwhelmed by responsibilities. When the kitchen faucet broke and George wasn't available, I turned to Mathew. He arrived with his tools and fixed the problem with ease, but what struck me most was his attitude, a mix of calm and confidence that made everything seem simple. It was then I realized his company was comforting, though I attributed it to a need for someone to share those everyday moments that George no longer shared with me. Little by little, Mathew and I started talking more, initially about trivial things and later about deeper topics. I found myself looking forward to those encounters. Life felt lighter, less monotonous with him. Though I tried to convince myself our relationship was purely friendly, I couldn't ignore the connection that was starting to form. There was something in his gaze, in the way he listened, that unsettled me, and at the same time made me feel alive. My work as an interior designer had always been a source of passion for me, but I often felt like I lacked someone to share my ideas with. When Mathew suggested collaborating on some projects, I was thrilled. We spent hours discussing designs, sketches, and trends. These sessions became more than work. They were moments of complicity and mutual admiration. Sometimes I felt his words carried a different tone, a subtle flirtation I tried to ignore, but that stirred emotions in me I hadn't felt in a long time. Everything changed one evening when George came home late, and Mathew came over to discuss project details. Amid laughter and conversations about the absurdities of interior design, I felt something in his gaze shift. An accidental brush of our hands unleashed a wave of emotions I couldn't control. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and I realized I was crossing a dangerous line. From that point on, our interactions carried a different tension. Every time I saw him, I felt a part of me waiting, desiring him. I struggled against these thoughts, reminding myself we were just colleagues and neighbors, but reality was more complex. George remained distant, absorbed in his work, and I felt increasingly trapped between what should be and what I was starting to feel. The dinner George organized was meant to be a chance to break free from the routine and connect with friends. Although I tried to enjoy it, I knew the evening would be challenging. When Mathew arrived, I greeted him with a forced smile, trying to control the emotions his presence always stirred in me. His casual comment, "What a lovely night. I'm glad to be here," left me feeling vulnerable. I responded calmly, though inside I was filled with nervousness. Throughout the evening, Mathew was as charming as always. He socialized with our friends, joked with George, and fit seamlessly into the group. Yet every time our eyes met, I felt an electricity that forced me to look away quickly. I tried not to focus on him, but I couldn't help it. Our conversations, though seemingly innocent, about work, hobbies, and trivial matters, felt too natural, too intimate. I noticed George observing me, his glances carrying something between curiosity and suspicion. It made me uneasy, exposed. At dinner, I focused on the others, the laughter, and the lively conversations around the table. But even then, the tension between Mathew and me lingered. Seated across from each other, every brief meeting of our eyes felt like a silent dialogue only we understood. I tried to keep appearances, but I could tell George was watching. When the night wound down and the guests started to leave, I walked Mathew to the door. It was a brief moment, but loaded with unspoken emotions. We looked at each other in silence for a few seconds, as though our gazes wanted to say what our words couldn't. Thank you for tonight, he said softly. His tone was so simple yet warm, it left me breathless. I tried to reply lightly, but inside, I was in turmoil. His look before he left seemed to say much more than he was willing to speak. Closing the door behind him, I returned to the living room where George was tidying up the table. His comment caught me off guard, though I had anticipated it. You've been spending a lot of time with Mathew. The statement was direct without any frills, and it hit me deeply. I tried to respond casually, suggesting he was jealous, but his reply left me speechless. No, of course not, but it seems like you two have gotten very close. His words carried a tone I hadn't heard in a long time, a mix of insecurity and reproach. I felt trapped, knowing I couldn't justify what was really happening. I tried to reassure him, saying it was all work-related, but his look showed he wasn't convinced. That conversation left a heavy weight on my chest. I knew something had changed between George and me, and it was my fault. Our relationship, already weakened by routine and emotional distance, was crumbling, and I could no longer ignore it. A few days later, I received an unexpected message from Mathew. He said he wasn't feeling well and asked if I could come over. My initial reaction was concern, but I also felt something else, a mix of excitement and fear. Why was he asking me for help? Without overthinking, I rushed to his house. When I arrived, I found him lying on the couch, visibly weak. His face was pale and his eyes seemed dim. I quickly sat beside him to check on him. I asked what was wrong, and he, with a tired smile, downplayed it. I just overdid it in the sun yesterday, thanks for coming. Even so, I couldn't help but worry. I placed my hand on his forehead to check for a fever, and in that moment, our eyes met in a way they never had before. There was something in his gaze that completely disarmed me. As I went to fetch a glass of water, he gently stopped me, holding my wrist. That small gesture froze me in place. María, he whispered, his voice carrying something he had been holding back for weeks. Before I could react, he leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was soft, almost delicate, but it was filled with an intensity I couldn't ignore. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion. I didn't push him away, though I knew I should. The moment was brief, but it felt eternal. When I pulled away, the weight of what had just happened hit me like a storm. I stammered excuses, unable to form coherent sentences. I got up and left his house in a hurry, feeling like the air had become unbreathable. As I crossed the street back to my home, my mind was a tornado of thoughts. I felt guilty, like a traitor, but I also couldn't ignore what had just happened. Back home, I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized my reflection. I knew I couldn't justify what had happened, that I had crossed a line I never thought I would. I tried convincing myself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. But something deep inside me knew it wasn't that simple. That kiss wasn't an accident. It was the result of weeks of suppressed emotions and feelings I hadn't wanted to admit. That night, when George returned home, I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. Everything in me screamed guilt, and though he didn't say anything, I felt like he could sense the change in me. The hours crawled by, filled with a tense silence louder than any words. I knew I had broken something in our relationship, something that might never be repaired. But the most terrifying part was that I couldn't stop thinking about Mathew, his gaze, his kiss, and everything that moment had meant. Each passing day felt like being trapped in a whirlwind of emotions I could no longer control. I had decided to cut all communication with Mathew, believing it was the only way to save my marriage and myself from this chaos. For days, I ignored his messages, didn't answer his calls, and didn't open the door when I heard his footsteps near my house. I clung to the hope that distance and time would cool what I was feeling, but deep down, a part of me knew it wouldn't be that easy. George continued with his routines, waking up early, going to work, and coming home late at night as always. But the silence in the house became more unbearable every day. Every corner reminded me of the moments I shared with Mathew and how I had crossed a line I didn't want to admit. On the outside, I tried to appear calm, though George noticed the tension in my behavior. Still, he said nothing. It was as if he hoped everything would resolve itself. Our conversations grew increasingly superficial, a mechanical exchange of empty phrases. I could feel the distance between us growing, and though it broke my heart to realize it, I couldn't find a way to stop it. One day, George suggested we spend a weekend at his parents' countryside house. "It'll do us good to get away from the routine," he said. The idea seemed like a good one. Perhaps a change of scenery could help us reconnect. When we arrived, surrounded by the forest and lake, I tried to focus on the moment, but I couldn't stop my mind from constantly drifting back to Mathew. George tried to break the ice with a joke that, in the past, would have made me laugh. Now I could only offer a weak smile. We were sitting by the lake when he suddenly broke the silence with a question that left me frozen. "You've been acting strange lately," he said, looking at me with curiosity. I tried to stay calm, though inside a knot was forming in my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, hoping to divert the topic. "You're distant. It seems like something's always on your mind. Is something going on?" His voice was soft and his eyes searched for answers I couldn't give him. I couldn't confess what was really happening, so I resorted to the easiest excuse. "I'm just tired. You work a lot too, and we barely see each other. I guess it's all just built up. I just need some time." Though he nodded, I knew he didn't fully believe me. That growing distance between us didn't disappear with that trip. We returned home just as estranged as when we had left. George returned to his routine of long work hours, and I was left alone, battling my thoughts and guilt. I tried to stay firm in my decision to cut ties with Mathew, but he didn't give up. His messages kept coming, brief and respectful, as if he understood my internal conflict but wasn't willing to disappear completely. One night, while George worked late, I received a message that unraveled all the emotions I was trying to suppress. "Hi, Maria. We need to talk. I respect your decision if you want to end everything, but I think we should at least talk about it." My hands trembled as I read those words. I knew I should ignore him, but I couldn't. I stared at the screen for a long time before finally typing a response. "Mathew, I don't know what's happening between us. This shouldn't have happened. Give me time." Though I sent those words, I knew time wouldn't change anything. The connection I felt with Mathew wasn't fleeting. It was a feeling that grew within me, something I couldn't ignore or control. Shortly after, George announced he'd be away for a week at a work conference. His absence was a relief, but also a challenge. I knew that without him at home, the barriers I'd tried to build to keep Mathew away would be harder to maintain. The morning after George left, I received another message from Mathew. "Maria, can we meet? I respect your desire to distance yourself, but I need to talk to you." I knew I shouldn't respond, but something inside me had already decided. After hours of hesitation, I finally wrote, "Come tomorrow morning." That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned in bed, fighting my thoughts. By morning, as I waited for him to arrive, I tried to distract myself with household chores, but with every passing minute, the tension inside me grew. When I heard the doorbell, my heart nearly stopped. I opened the door, and there he was. We looked at each other in silence for a few seconds before I stepped aside to let him in. "I'm glad you decided to see me," he said, his voice soft but serious. "I'm glad too," I replied, though my words barely came out as a whisper. We sat in the living room, at first trying to keep the conversation on neutral topics, but soon it became clear we both felt the same tension that had been building between us. Mathew broke the silence. "Maria, we can't keep pretending this isn't real. There's something between us, and you can't ignore it forever." His honesty disarmed me. I tried to argue, to deny what he was saying, but before I could, he leaned in and kissed me. This time, I didn't try to resist. There were no doubts, no reservations. I let myself go, knowing there was no turning back. We ended up in bed, and in those moments I felt an intensity I hadn't experienced in years. It was as if all the guilt, tension, and desire that had built up exploded. But when it was over, reality came crashing back. We lay in silence, knowing what we had done would change our lives forever. As we rested together, I asked quietly, "What do we do now?" Mathew looked at me seriously but with a tenderness that made me tremble. "I don't know, Maria, but I don't regret anything." After that night with Mathew, everything inside me changed. The house, the routine, even the passing days felt the same, but I wasn't the same person anymore. I was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, longing, and confusion. On one hand, the guilt weighed heavily on me. I couldn't look George in the eye without feeling an unbearable weight on my chest. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, was a reminder of my betrayal. On the other hand, I couldn't stop thinking about Mathew, his touch, his presence, the way he made me feel alive. I knew what I had done was wrong, but the fire of desire inside me didn't fade, and that torment consumed me. When George returned from his trip, I tried to act as if nothing had happened, as if everything was fine. But my behavior betrayed me. He noticed my distance, my inability to be present in our conversations, or to enjoy the small moments together. Over breakfast, he looked at me directly and asked, "What's wrong, Maria? You've been acting differently since I got back." I tried to deflect, blaming work and stress, but I could see he wasn't convinced. It was in his eyes, in the way he looked at me with suspicion. Though he didn't press further, I knew he suspected something was wrong. The gap between us widened with every passing day, and though it broke my heart, I couldn't summon the courage to tell him the truth. Meanwhile, Mathew continued to reach out. Every time I saw his name on my phone, my heart raced. I tried to respond coldly, hoping to sever the ties between us, but I couldn't resist the temptation to reply. The internal conflict was unbearable. I knew I should stay away from him, but I couldn't deny the feelings that had grown inside me. One night, while George was working late, I received a message from Mathew that shook me to my core. "Maria, we need to talk. I can't keep going like this." I didn't respond, but his words lingered in my mind. It was clear we couldn't continue this way. My life was unraveling, and the double life I was trying to maintain was unsustainable. When George came home that night, I was sitting on the couch, lost in my thoughts. He looked at me with concern and sat down next to me. "Maria, what's happening to us? I feel like you've distanced yourself. I can tell something's changed between us," he said, his voice filled with sadness and worry. In that moment, I couldn't hold it in any longer. Tears streamed down my face, and between sobs, I confessed everything. I told him about Mathew, how we had grown closer, the connection we shared, and the night we spent together. Each word was like a dagger, both for him and for me. His expression shifted from disbelief to deep pain. "I can't believe you did this. You've destroyed everything," he said, his voice trembling. He stood up and left the house without another word. That night, George didn't come home, and the following days were pure agony. I knew my confession had ended our marriage. I tried reaching out to him, but he didn't respond. When he finally returned, it was only to pack his belongings. His gaze was cold and indifferent, as if I no longer existed to him. "I'm filing for divorce. I don't want to hear from you again," he said before leaving for good. His words shattered me. I knew I had lost everything. My marriage, my stability, even my self-respect. The house was now filled with an oppressive silence, a constant reminder of everything I had destroyed. Determined to put an end to the situation with Mathew, I decided to meet him one last time. When I arrived at his house, his face lit up with hope, but I already knew what I had to do. I told him we couldn't continue, that I needed to rebuild my life, and that our relationship was a mistake that had ruined my marriage. Mathew tried to persuade me, but I stood firm. I left his house knowing I had closed that chapter for good, though the emptiness inside me was overwhelming. Shortly after, the divorce papers arrived. Signing them was like accepting that the life I once knew was over. I didn't argue anything. I knew George deserved everything, and I didn't want to prolong the pain. In the days that followed, I was forced to face the consequences of my actions. The house, once filled with love and dreams, was now a constant reminder of what I had lost. The nights became endless, and regret haunted me relentlessly. I had destroyed everything I loved, and all that was left was silence and pain. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you in any way, be sure to subscribe to Unforgettable Love Stories for more stories like this one.